Annexation and early statehood. This era is about when Texas became a state in the United States of America. Why did the U.S. want to annex Texas? This all comes down to the answer of westward expansion and manifest destiny. So from the beginning of the United States, they wanted to establish themselves as a sovereign nation, but they also wanted to expand. They had this idea, this basic belief called manifest destiny, that it was ordained. So the manifest part is that God had given them this land that they could go in and take over, and it was their destiny to own said land. That means they should acquire all the land that spanned from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. When did the U.S. try to acquire Texas? It started back in 1803 with the Louisiana Territory. The U.S. consistently attempted to purchase Texas while it was under the authority of both Spain and Mexico. That's while Texas was under the authority of both Spain and Mexico. The U.S. first began discussing the idea of adding Texas to the Union at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. Whenever they bought Louisiana from France in 1803, the next step would have been to move westward towards Texas, in this area here. Why wasn't Texas annexed immediately after the Texas Revolution? Why didn't they try to become annexed right off the bat whenever they were no longer under Mexican authority? Remember, Mexico was not willing to give up Texas, so now Mexico doesn't have control of Texas. So why shouldn't they be annexed? What happened to the U.S. opinion then? Well, what happened is some fear. One of the main issues Texas faced from 1836 to 1845, while Texas was a republic, was conflict with Mexico. You saw that repeatedly in the Republic of Texas notes video. Texas and Mexico didn't agree on their borders, didn't agree on Texas independence, so a lot of conflict resulted from their disagreements. So when Texans voted in favor of annexing Texas to the United States in September of 1836, the President of the United States at the time, President Van Buren, refused to annex Texas because he was afraid that Mexico would want to go to war with the United States for annexing Texas. Because remember, Mexico still feels like they have control of Texas at this time. The U.S. was also keeping a balance of slave states and free states. This issue had already come up. Texas would have upset the abolitionist movement at the time, that anti-slavery movement, and upset the balance. Why did Great Britain get involved? So we're talking about Texas, the U.S., and Mexico. Why in the world would Great Britain get involved? Well, there's kind of a power struggle going on here because England or Great Britain is going to recognize that the United States is growing and they're kind of trying to build an empire here. So Great Britain made it very clear that they did not wish to see Texas annexed to the United States because they were worried about the U.S. imperialist agenda that tied to westward expansion. That means, this word imperialist, is if the U.S. was trying to expand and build an empire, that would compete with Great Britain's empire. Why did the U.S. change their mind about Texas? Well, because Great Britain. So President John Tyler of the United States began to propose Texas annexation because he feared that Great Britain would try to annex Texas. His thought is, if we can't annex Texas, maybe they'll try to annex Texas because they're starting to recognize that Texas would be valuable. His first annexation proposal in June of 1844 was rejected by the U.S. Senate. So how did Texas influence the U.S. presidential election of 1844? Well, James K. Polk was one of the candidates. He supported annexation. The other candidate was Henry Clay. He did not support annexation. He was actually against annexation of Texas. So James K. Polk won the election. This means if the main ticket issue was annexation, then the presidential election gauged the opinions of the people, which meant that the people of the United States wanted to annex Texas. This is a map of the 1844 election from 270 to win. You can see in the blue, those are the people that voted for James K. Polk. Those in the purple are those who voted for Henry Clay. This is a visual of who said yes to annexation. If that is the main ticket item, then that is what they're voting for. They're voting for the president who will expand the United States, and that was James K. Polk. So after the election takes place, there's still a short time frame where John Tyler is still going to be the president. So when we ask the question, who is responsible for the annexation of Texas, the answer is John Tyler, James K. Polk, but mainly the American people, because they are the ones who cast their vote. While still in office as president, John Tyler suggested that the annexation of Texas be accomplished through something called a joint resolution. This would make it so that it would be more like passing a law than trying to add a territory. The U.S. would offer Texas statehood under the condition that Texas would keep their public lands and that the U.S. would acquire government lands. This means Texas would join the United States directly as a state and would not have to become a territory because they had a high enough population that they didn't have to be a territory. The resolution was easier to pass with a majority vote from both sides than to pass a treaty, like what was put forth by John Tyler earlier before, where the Senate rejected it. Congress passed this resolution February 1845. They passed it more like a law than like a treaty. So how did Britain respond? How did Great Britain get involved again? They kind of stirred up some trouble. The British still hoped to prevent annexation. Even after the vote was cast and the agreement was made, when the resolution was put forth, Texas still had to vote on this resolution. So the British still had hope that Texas would not be annexed to the United States. And they advised the government of Mexico to get involved. They told Mexico, if you acknowledge Texas independence, Texas won't join the United States. So they advised the government of Mexico to acknowledge Texas independence on the condition that Texas not be annexed to the United States. Remember, Great Britain does not want the United States to grow anymore. They don't want them to expand. Texas would add to the United States. It would add to their territory. It would mean U.S. expansion. This is not something that Great Britain wants, so they get Mexico involved. Now, would Mexico have gotten involved either way? Probably. So remember the Texas president, Anson Jones. Well, he's going to get Texas to sign the joint resolution. Texas President Dr. Anson Jones called the Texan Congress together to meet on June the 16th, 1845 to discuss the terms of the joint resolution put forth by the U.S. Congress. A convention of elected delegates met on July the 4th, 1845, and both Congress and the convention voted in favor of annexation. So the U.S. has said yes at this point, and now Texas says yes to this joint resolution as well. So when did Texas officially become a state? December 29th, 1845. A state constitution was ratified, which means approved, in October of 1845, and then accepted by the United States Congress on December 29th, 1845, making this the date of the Texas legal entry into the Union. On February 19, 1846, James Pinckney Henderson was given leadership of Texas as the governor of Texas, and Dr. Anson Jones was no longer the president of the Republic of Texas because there was no longer a Republic of Texas. It was now a state of the Union. Just because Texas has now joined the United States does not mean that the issues are over. They are far from over. Texas joining the United States is actually going to cause more problems. The effects of Texas statehood. 1. The Mexican-American War. There was still the question about the definition of Texas' border with Mexico, that disputed territory that you saw on the map before. President James K. Polk sent General Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande to secure the river as the Texas true border, and this is going to cause problems. There will be a scuffle and a war will break out. Mexico did not recognize Texas independence and claimed that Texas' border was at the Nueces River. The war lasted for 2 years. The result of the Mexican-American War, Mexico and the U.S. signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the Texas border and now the U.S. border. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million for California, Nevada, Utah, along with parts of Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. This was called the Mexican Cession. Another effect was the Texas territory and Texas debt. Texas was a massive state after the war. It stretched the length of the Rio Grande, and all the states that were listed in the Mexican Cession, bits and pieces of that were included in Texas. Texas agreed on something called the Compromise of 1850, in which they gave up their Northwest Territory. So if you look at the map, this whole area here, their Northwest Territory, is going to be sold to the United States in the Compromise of 1850. Texas will give up this Northwest Territory in exchange for $10 million. So the results of the Compromise of 1850, Texas gave up its territory in the Northwest area of Texas. The U.S. paid Texas $10 million. The present-day state borders were set, so the background that you see here, this shape of Texas was set. It is final. That's what Texas will be all the way up to this day. And Texas is going to get out of debt. That payout will help eliminate their debt. And that's all for now.